So today there's a trust model that exists with the verifier community in credentials that come from the legitimate issuing authority from the jurisdictions in the US and Canada. So this trust model is less of the verifier knowing exactly what each jurisdiction's process is and making a decision based off of that, and more just having trust in knowing that the product came from a reliable issuing authority and having trust that they have good processes in place. The documents from the issuing authorities are generally accepted, even with little education or tools to be able to determine a genuine from a non-genuine certificate. So depending, of course, on what the risk is for the verifier party, and more often than not, whatever credential or documents accepted to the verifier is generally accepted as a proof of ID for that individual. Their confidence still exists, albeit the thousands of counterfeits that are in rotation daily that are being used for several different people for several different reasons. Again, the verifier community or the relying parties still have huge confidence in the products that are presented to them that they use as far as identity for their services. And that is just the reality of the situation. So it's not perfect system. Obviously, there's always room for improvement, but it is what we have today. And for the most part, obviously does seem to be working. So how do we strengthen this? In 2008, the Department of Homeland Security issued the Real ID Act, which establishes minimum standards for driver licenses and ID cards that will be used for federal purposes. Many jurisdictions are, in fact, have implemented Real ID solutions in their states, but DHS has pushed out their compliance date for when these cards need to be accepted through 2021 as a result of the pandemic. The Real ID Act basically, in the requirements or the standards it's established, has rules around the documents that can be accepted as a proofing and vetting process prior to the Real ID being issued, and some of those standard issuance processes as far as like when the photo needs to be taken, those types of things. There are, of course, documents that each jurisdiction may issue that's not a Real ID document, and the Real ID standards, of course, don't apply to those documents. These documents are still being used in a lot of non-federal cases as proof of identity with the verifier community today and are accepted. But having said that, the Real ID standards have significantly improved the landscape for the proofing and vetting processes for jurisdictions and helping to strengthen that trust between the verifier community and the issuing authorities. So what is the vision for mobile driver license? So we envision somewhat of the same thing. What we'd like to see is that trust I talked about before being maintained from the verifier community to the issuing authorities. So again, without the issuing authorities knowing exactly what the jurisdiction or the issuing authorities processes for how they provisioned and what documents they accepted, those types of things, to be able to know that the mDL coming from the jurisdiction is trustable because it's coming from the jurisdiction. So that trust framework and that confidence in the issuing authority should not change with the move to mobile. There are, of course, going to be vulnerabilities, just like we talked about with the physical credentials. There's a potential for counterfeit products and for fakes to come across your table. But with the mobile driver license solution, we are looking at a better solution, more likely than the physical credentials. So we're definitely no worse off than we are today. If anything, we have a better design and mechanism in place, which Lofi will talk about a little bit more as we move forward. But we're definitely no worse off than we are today, and we're building a stronger, better solution for the products that will be provided to the issuing authorities for use for ID. And just like with the physical credentials, there are standards. The Real ID standards, of course, are being trying to be updated to be able to incorporate mobile driver licenses used for Real ID. There's also standards that have been developed that are close to being cooked with the ISO groups that I'll get into a little bit later in this presentation, I think, with you, that really helps out the ground rules for the interoperability and, again, helping to establish the trust model for the mobile driver licenses.
Issuing authorities, by and large, want to do the same thing they do today even better in the case of an MDL. So our members came to us and said, our credentials, our physical credentials are being accepted almost everywhere as identity documents. What should we be doing so that the same will be true for the mobile credentials that we issue? So to answer that question, AMBA and the mDL working group that consists of jurisdictional representatives are in the process of compiling requirements and or best practices that would help jurisdictions to answer those questions. Next. Those areas would cover, among other things, like your app security features. Next. What you could do to protect the data, both while on the app or while it's being handled by an intermediary. And next, what you should be doing on the side of provisioning your mDL to make sure that you have a solid solution. Our intent is coming up with these guidelines to make use of existing standards and or practices as much as possible. We don't want to reinvent the wheel, and to provide a full suite of references to our members. We envision that eventually, with the necessary stakeholder input, this would become a good baseline for Real ID compliance, and by extension to the issuance of non-Real ID credentials as well. So that's the one side of how we're helping issuing authorities to make sure that they can be in a position to issue trustworthy products. When it comes to verifying that a document that I'm working with, we're working on what we call the trust model, which is on the next slide. So AMVA is currently investigating different public key administration models. In order to authenticate an MDL, you need to authenticate using a public key of the issuing authority, and you need to trust that it actually came from the issuing authority. And so the challenge is that you have many issuing authorities and you have many verifiers. And what we're looking at is how can we set up, what's the best solution for public key administrator? And once we know that, we can see how can we set that up. And so next illustrates the problem by saying that you have many public certificates that you use to get to a public key administrator. And that public key administrator has the function of next determining what the origin is, next that the quality is good, and next would want to disseminate the public certificates to the verifiers. As I've said, AMVA is in the process of investigating what solutions there are to this challenge and what the best one would be. And as a shameless plug, we are issuing an RFI in this area later this year, and if anyone's interested, we'd encourage you to participate in that endeavor.
These are all outlined in section 6 of the white paper on the STA website and available from mdlconnection.com. That white paper lists, I think it's 11 different risks and challenges to the ecosystem. I'm going to just talk about 2 of them myself, and then the others are covering the other 11. So these are also opportunities for us to kickstart a really robust mDL ecosystem to make things really work widely. When you look at the one factor that will most ensure consumers adopt this, it's that if this is accepted everywhere, they know they can walk with their card today and use it anywhere they need to present ID. And that needs to be true of mDL as well. And I'll discuss some of the things that are challenges, some of the things you need to jump over to get to that point. And they fit into really kind of 2 frameworks. One is having really robust interaction modes so that verifiers choose to go ahead and accept mDLs, and that also that the verifiers choose to accept them in ways that fit their business and expand their business opportunities or expand the way that they accept mDLs. And then the other is sort of what the market forces are behind the start off of this ecosystem, because it could start slowly or it could start really quickly and roll really quickly. So both of these are things we can work on in STA to help these forces. Go ahead to the next one. So looking at that, the full-featured rollout, essentially looking at the ability of mDLs to support multiple different interaction modes. If you just take a quick look at first blush at how you think some of these verifiers may want to accept an mDL. In a restaurant, it would work really well for the waiter to walk up, scan over your shoulder with a QR code, go to Bluetooth or go to a quick online request to the issuing authority and pull the data. This can work really well, works well within the flow of that particular interaction. TSA has, and we heard in webinar, I believe 2 and 3 about TSA, how TSA is looking at accepting this, and they very much want to start with offline transactions with an NFC tap, and then moving to something like Wi-Fi aware for the data transfer. So they want to do that offline. If you look at a supermarket, right now in many supermarkets, you walk in and there's a plexiglass window. You see a sign there which may be hard to read, but it's like, please, consider using contactless payments, because we don't want cards to change hands any longer. So using that NFC device that you see there seems logical first step for supermarkets or any market that sells an age-restricted product. And of course, roadside stop, where you've got a distance and safety security measures may have that officer want to make a distance connection. So there's a variety of ways in which verifiers will want to accept the mDLs. If mDL solutions come out and only support one of those, then verifiers may say, okay, well, I can change my business process a little and I'll do that. That can be really helpful jumpstarting the ecosystem. Or they might say no, and that would be a deterrent to jumpstarting this ecosystem. How can we as STA work together to make sure that this rich mDL's ecosystem builds quickly and builds in a good time frame and meets consumer demand? So issuers are providing a civic service. They do today. They know that these identity cards are used, that we use our cards as identity cards, and I think we have to be respectful of that and see what their role is and really understand their role and treat that role with respect. If we engage with issuers and verifiers really early and we get the conversation going with all the parties, issuers, verifiers, consumers as well, we can be listening to needs, establish some early adopters. I think this is one of the key things that can happen through STA working groups, is to reach verifiers now, educate them, and pull them in so that we are working together to build this ecosystem. The concept of sort of expanding choice to support multiple different workflows in a business is also possible. And then also the selecting mDLs that support multiple interaction modes is what I mentioned on this. So how do we educate enough that that balance is well known, that the interaction modes are well known, and the decision makers are choosing those. And in some cases, I'll call out Florida that had an RFP, for example, there will be multiple mDL solutions available to the residents of that state. And so residents get to choose, and they can make their choices as well, and they'll end up choosing the one that is accepted everywhere. So again, I think it's through STA, through the Identity Council, we can start to make these connections and start to get that message out about a full ecosystem. Go ahead to the next slide. The other thing that's interesting here is we're really pulling together a marketplace in that, where one kind of doesn't exist now. The consumer has the demand, and they may not adopt until they know where they can use their mDL. This is a possibility. And at the same time, verifiers may not adopt until they see a significant number of mDLs. So I think we've always described this as two mountains that are being scaled in order to everyone meet at the lake in the middle. And this is definitely a challenge. How can we find ways that jumpstart this, that pull together those early adopters, publicize use cases really well, and start to get over that initial hurdle to build the marketplace for this? So some of the things we need are these challenges for issuers and verifiers to express their needs. I mean, card standards have worked well for verifiers to lower the risk. They hold the identity risk. They are the ones who need to be in compliance. They're the ones who have a transaction of some value for which they need identity to meet the risk of that value. So card standards have done well to lower that risk and to even distance the need. The issuers say, oh, I do the card standard, and then the verifiers accept that card standard. Same thing here with ISO 18013-5. The issuers can use that standard knowing that verifiers will accept that standard. And that's a key piece of this, is taking those card standards and making sure that they are used to help pull that marketplace together. Also, the interoperability of that standard, me being able to take my mDL and go to multiple different interactions, multiple different businesses, and use it across them because the standard exists, that also kind of lowers the hurdle. And so there's sort of these two sets of demands that are there, and the ability for everyone to be listening to what those demands are, to jump early, to take action, and kind of pull this marketplace together. It's one of the key challenges that we have.
I'm glad that Lofi mentioned a role of a public key administrator that would set minimum requirements that need to be fulfilled before an issuing authority CA certificate can be included in a trusted master list. Next. We strongly suggest working towards a set of common issuing authority policy, process, and technology requirements. We believe that testing and certification in the context of an mDL assurance program could be instrumental to obtaining assurance that these requirements are met and in conveying evidence of that assurance. Let's have a look at some key areas which will likely be addressed: the public key infrastructure, the provisioning process, and the mDL app. Next. To start with the latter, mDL apps need to function properly and be interoperable with mDL reader implementations that conform to ISO 18013-5. mDLs need to be properly secured to protect against unauthorized use or identity theft. And privacy-enhancing technology needs to be implemented to give the mDL holder full control over their data and to enforce that only data is being shared that the holder consents to. To obtain assurance that these objectives are met, an mDL assurance program may provide privacy review, cybersecurity evaluation, and conformity assessment against ISO 18013-5. Next. To look at the provisioning process and PKI, let's zoom in into some key functions in the issuing authority infrastructure. Next. First of all, we have the system of record, which is the source of truth when it comes to the holder's identity information. The identity information that is in the system of record is the result of an enrollment process which may be related compliant and in which the necessary identity assurance processes have been implemented, eventually according to standards like NIST SP 863. Next. The issuing authority PKI is as important as the system of record when it comes to trusting an mDL. The issuing authority's electronic signature is placed on the mDL data that is provisioned to an mDL. That electronic signature, which is created with the issuing authority's private key, provides proof of origin, integrity, and authenticity of the mDL. Control of that private key enables signing on behalf of the issuing authority. That private key should be, therefore, one of the best kept secrets in a state or province. The corresponding public key is made available in the issuing authority's public key certificate. The issuing authority CA certificate is used by an mDL reader to verify the electronic signature on the mDL data to confirm that the mDL is authentic and originates from the issuing authority. Without that certificate, an mDL cannot be authenticated. The issuing authority CA public key certificate should therefore belong to the most commonly published information within the issuing jurisdiction and far beyond. The requirements for protection of the issuing authority CA private key and conditions for its use are laid down in a certificate policy and certification practice statement. Typically, there are requirements for private keys to be stored in a hardware security module, requirements for physical and logical access to the issuing authority CA system, and the hardware security module for key management, etc. In short, requirements for people, process, and technology involved in PKI operations. Next. In the data preparation and document signing function, a driving license holder's information from the system of record is structured into an ISO 18013 Part 5 compliant data structure. This is combined with some information from the mDL app and then electronically signed to establish trust in the data. Next. Credential management is a function where processes for enrollment and user identification, mDL app and device discovery, and the actual provisioning takes place, and where the digital credential status is maintained. This function is essential in the process of tying the mDL holder, their record in the system, the app, and the mobile device together, and to ensure that the right set of data ends up on the right mobile device. If the processes in these four key functions are correctly implemented and the protocols for interaction between those functions and the mDL are well protected and secure, an mDL can become as trustworthy as a biometric passport. Next. To obtain assurance that an issuing authority's mDL implementation indeed is highly trustworthy, a number of assurance activities can be carried out. During a PKI audit, processes and technology can be reviewed and confirmed to implement the requirements and meet the objectives laid down in the certificate policy and certification practice statement. Cybersecurity assessment and penetration tests can provide assurance that the issuing authority infrastructure is reasonably secured and protected from unauthorized use. ISO 18013 Part 5 conformity assessment on the mDL data structures and PKI certificate formats provides the assurance that the data preparation and document signing function produces data sets that can be universally interpreted by compliant mDL readers and so contribute to achieving the objective of global interoperability. Next. Within the context of an mDL assurance program, an issuing authority can collect evidence from the various assurance activities. With the necessary test reports and certificates, the issuing authority can demonstrate to the public key administrator that their processes and technology fulfill the applicable policies and requirements. Upon confirmation of that compliance, the issuing authority CA certificate should be admitted on the master list, which can be used by mDL verifiers and relying parties in their mDL readers to confidently accept trusted and interoperable mDLs.
What we on the Identity Council really have, the tools in our toolbox are the activities that we have. Yes, we look at mDL, but we also look at other things. We support the Access Council. We work with other industry councils as well. We have a number of activities with the federal government, but I want to talk to you specifically about the efforts on mDL and some of the pieces that you've seen today and where we're walking into the future. Some of the key things like today's webinar: how do we raise awareness? How do we provide education? How do we start initial coordination? How do we really focus on those relying parties themselves? How do we start looking at the needs of relying parties and others? Okay. And again, what are some of the key challenges to adoption so that we as a greater community can go forward? So next slide. We've organized ourselves and we've grown over time essentially to a group that includes really characteristics of two different pieces. One, the capability providers, those people that provide the end-to-end capability for the consumers, for the market space. Okay. And the other piece of this is the relying parties working hand in hand. whether they're merchants, the transportation community, the health community, others. How do others look at this? How do they consider adoption as relying parties? What are the investments? What's the challenges going forward? So in some cases, you're going to see on the capability providers, we're working very closely with AMVA and the state issuers. We have those that make the products, those that are actually the service providers. And then again, when we look over at some of the relying parties, whether that a relying party might be someone like TSA, or when we're looking at the healthcare community and others, how do we start really understanding the needs of people? So this is how we've organized. Again, for those that are relying parties listening, I want to talk directly about how you might participate in the future. Next slide, please. In the initial activities that we've done a strong white paper about both the mDL, the ecosystem, the strengths, the values. For those that haven't seen the white paper, I encourage you to look at it. It's available online. It's a very strong white paper. It says, here's where we are, where we're going. Here's where we're at. Here's some things that we need to address as a community, and hopefully you're picking up some of those today. Again, David laid out the path of the webinars that you're hearing today. And the next one that you'll hear is probably in December. And again, this is starting to go into the discussions of how, as a relying party, do you start thinking about consuming mDLs that have been issued by another state? Okay, so that should be a really great discussion. I'd ask you to keep an eye out for that, because again, part of this is we have a very dynamic environment. We have a very distributed environment. So how do we start planning that discussion between issuers, the people that provide the capabilities, and the relying parties? So that discussion will take place in December. Next slide, please. So when we talk about relying party focused activities, so we worked with the Alliance's chapter organization, the U.S. Payments Forum. Again, that represents all the major retailers. They look at merchants and retail communities, the rule sets that they have, what their preferences are, deep understanding of that community. So again, it gives us the ability to understand what key issues might be for the community, what the priorities are. As we talk over for transportation, if you've listened to some of the earlier webinars, TSA is an early relying party, and as they're thinking about things like use cases of bag drop, bag pickup, in addition to some of the screening. As we talk to the airports, how do the airports start thinking about this as well? So as we walk through different communities, okay, the healthcare community is working pilots on this, looking at everything from the pharma and the clinic side over to procurements as well. On the federal side, again, you will be from the Real ID Act and Real ID Act compliance. The federal government needs to check the document that you present, whether it's a standard card, driver's license, or an mDL, does it meet Real ID? Again, another customer in this discussion. State and local governments, they consume driver's licenses as a matter of course. Again, certainly the law enforcement community, okay, but also other communities. Again, the food and beverage community, you saw that in one of David's presentations before. Okay, next slide, please. So when we talk about the guidance that needs to take place, what is it you as a relying party that has an enterprise, what are the key issues? What is it really required to make a decision on your side about a change in enterprise operations? So again, part of this is relying parties need to know. In some case, for a group like Nascent, who really looks at all of the states in coordination with the states and really between the IT leaders in the state, how would they consume an mDL? This is a primary benefit, and it really helps the launch of the ecosystem. Next slide, please. So as we're looking forward, in the white paper, we've seen areas that we can prioritize on and work together looking in the future. One of the key things that I'm asking everyone that's part of the webinar and those that listen into the future is how do you want to participate? There's room for everybody. This is very, very big. As we look at this, there's efforts that UL will be leading on the test and certification side. There's activities that AMVA really does want your participation and support. We have relying parties that really need to understand how, as a community of relying parties, whether that's the aviation sector or the law enforcement sector, what's the key dependencies? If we just talk about the law enforcement community themselves, they have 14 different use cases. And you would say, well, how does this integrate with e-ticketing? How does this integrate in with driver's license readers? If we're talking on the healthcare side, one of the things that you would say is, well, how does this integrate with the pharma operations, the clinic operations? Okay. On the health services side, some of the questions that people are looking at is an mDL in addition identities are available. How will that support better health services and health delivery? So there is a lot of activities that are starting in parallel. When we talk about jump-starting the ecosystem, no one will really see value if they only look at a single relying party. So some of the strategies that we're looking at is how do we bring multiple relying parties together so that the user experience is richer, where it really makes sense for somebody to consider buying an mDL because there'll be certain numbers of relying parties that are ready to work together. If the individual consumers get value, and if the relying parties get value, part of the coordination is can we discount? Can we incentivize? How might we do that? That was raised earlier in the discussion. So one of the first communities that you'll see some level of density, some level of commitment around various relying parties will probably be the aviation community. But for those that are on the line, one of the questions that I would ask is, how would you start driving this within your communities because there's just so much value? Next slide, please. So the ask that we really want people to consider is, first, let's support the overall awareness and education of the ISO-based standard. Okay, the standard should be complete by the end of the year. It should be published early next year. We'll have a final standard. Okay, how do we think about an mDL? Well, just think about right off the bat, where do you consume a driver's license? And already knowing that an mDL can reduce cost, reduce risk. It provides a much better quality of service and life, user experience. That's going to drive us into this touch-free experience in itself. Okay, so again, on these things, please consider. If you have working groups now, think about the discussion in your working group. Think about how we might work and collaborate together. And lastly, if we collaborate, whether you're the rental car community, which we're collaborating with, or the National Notaries Association, or other groups, how might you want to have representatives part of our team that are taking place within the core group so that they're getting a more holistic understanding of what's going on, how they can look at, if you would, people that have same problem, different problem set. So we encourage you, again, to participate looking into the future.